Let's talk about 10%. 10% of what? You may have heard, as I have many times, that the S&P 500 has returned 10% on average for the last 100 years. I heard that just this morning. So let's dive into this. First of all, the S&P 500 didn't exist 100 years ago. The S&P 90 started in 1926, and data was available following that 1 year later, 1927. But the S&P 500 came to be in 1957. Now, that aside, that's just nitpicky, just to be specific and clear. But here's why I'm bringing up this 10% thing. When someone says the average return was 10%, two things occur. What they're doing is they're simply taking all of the 1 year returns, up 10%, down 3%, up 7%, down 13%, and so on. These isolated numbers, and they're getting the sum over the number of years they're looking at, or the periods, getting that sum and dividing by that number of years. So if they're looking at, as we are now, 98 years, it would be whatever the sum is divided by 98 to give you an average. But the average is just the average of what changed every year, which they refer to as a return. Okay, but it's what changed that year. What did my portfolio do, for example, or what did the index do? It went up 12%. That's it. The next year, what did that do? It went down 3%. No linkage, just it did this, it did this, it did this. Get the sum, divide. Why is that a problem? Because it doesn't say what actually happened to any true investment. If I put money into that index, if I were able to invest in it, or a stock, or a whatever that has in turn this statement about the average return, the actual dollar return, the actual return on investment is not stated in that average. And typically the figure will be dramatically different from what you're expecting. For example, if I invest $100 and it goes up 100% in year one, before we get into the results, in year two it goes down 50%. Isolated numbers, up 100, down 50. I take those, get the sum. 150, net of 50 is the answer there, sum. And then I divide by 2 for 2 years. I have an average return of 25%. Now we take our $100 to see what it looks like when we have an average return of 25% on our $100 investment. My $100 in year one goes up 100%. I have $200. My $200 in year two goes down 50%. I have, now it should be a 25% return, average, right? But my $200 down 50% is $100, right where I started. Where's my 25%? It's not there. When we look at an average return, people tend to do much the same. That is, they expect to see the average return, the percentage, something that moves their money in the right direction. So when someone says the S&P 500 has averaged a return of 10% over the last 100 years, they then turn around to say, so in the future, we should be able to get much the same, something close. Well, we can be conservative and talk about 9%. That would be the typical hedge. Well, as it turns out, just this morning, I came across a video of a young investment advisor or planner who was fielding a question from a young couple saying, 24 years old, want to retire at the age of 45. Here's what we have in our IRA. Here's what we have in our investment account. Here's what we want to do. Here's our current income. What can we do? So what he, the planner, did was he used software to come up with whether or not, based on what they're planning on doing and how much they've got invested and what their anticipation is on need, how much they'll need in retirement at the age of 45, whether or not they're going to make it. And in true, typical fashion, he looked at the money there, the anticipated additional money into the investments, and stated that with the S&P, well, it'll be conservative, it should be able to return 9% for the next 21 years. And then looked at retirement account, an IRA, same thing. Should be able to anticipate, should be able to get 9%. Where'd the 9% come from? Well, you know it's from that 10% statement that comes out all the time. So then in the process, using that software, because of their age, because of the limited number of years anticipating this retirement and the years they're putting away cash to build up and allowing that investment to grow at 9%, they only had a 64% probability of success. So he went back to the drawing board and said, what if we prolong the effort? Meaning, instead of retiring at 45, retire at 48. Now they have an 84% probability of success. And he made a suggestion, maybe you can put a little bit more away, maybe you can extend it another year or two, but you get the idea. The idea is you anticipate based on numbers you've heard, which are, let's call them an illusion. They are an illusion. Looking back on an average return based on that lack of connectivity between one year and the next, just getting the jumble of these numbers, getting the sum divided by the number of years, doesn't tell you what actually happened in the investment, doesn't tell you the actual return. And the actual return can be wildly different from what a 10% return would suggest. But they take that 10% average and now they project into the distance. They say, well, if we can replicate, okay, we'll be conservative and use 9%. That's where your peril is. When you go to an investment advisor, a financial planner, you do it on your own, whatever, and you look at an average return as stated by a talking head, a media expert, a guru of any sort, an advisor, and they say the average return was, those exact words, the average return was, and then they turn it around to say, and therefore we can project forward being conservative. You do so at your peril because the actual returns will be wildly different the longer you allow that to grow. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Retirement planning comes to mind. You will fall short. And in particular, well, let's be fair. Is it possible that a given investment can do better than 9% over time? Sure. Probable? No. The percentage winners that far exceed the average or any particular level in the marketplace with volatility that are intrinsically volatile, the number of significant winners is very limited, statistically speaking. Percentage-wise, very small. So if you're looking at mutual funds, you're automatically pulling back from what potential there is because you're now micro-diversified. A micro-diversification means you're anchored. You have too many different things that aren't going up 1,000%. They're sitting low. They're weighted down because of the lack of potential growth. We'll get into that another time. Micro-diversification, remember that phrase. But the idea of assuming a 10% average return gives you a 10% or 9% growth opportunity, and you rest your bets on that, you do so at your peril. One is they're saying something that is slightly typically misunderstood. Now, to follow up on that, let's try a little homework assignment. In 1927, at the end of the year, end of December, the S&P level was 17.66. Today, the S&P is hovering, well, let's call it roughly 7,000 to make it a nice round figure. 7,000. If you take 17.66 and assume a 10% growth per year, 98 times, what will you get? Now, the easy way to calculate that, although a little bit, let's call it labor intensive because you've got to use a pencil 98 times and a calculator. 17.66 times 1.1 will give you the next year's result, 10% higher. Then that figure times 1.1 again gives you the next year, and then again and again and again. So 17.66 times 1.1, that figure times 1.1, that figure times 1.1, that figure times 1.1, 98 times. Give it a try, put it to paper, and see what you get at the end of 98 years. See if it's roughly 7,000. Because if that 7,000 figure is higher, well, then you haven't done the 10% thing. You've done, you tell me, more or less. I suggest you'll get a number substantially higher than 7,000 at a 10% growth rate per year. Now, specifically, I'm including what would be characterized as compounding there. Important concept. But that's what is assumed when you turn, hey, the 10% average over the last 100 years, therefore we can look forward. That assumption is built into that looking forward of 10% per year, compounded. That's the way people do it. So again, go to 17.66 times 1.1, and that total times 1.1, 98 times, see what you get.